May 1551, Krakow. Queen Barbara Radziwiłł, only 30 years old, lies dying in her chamber. Her body wasted, her skin marked with sores, each breath a painful gasp. Whispers fill the court. Was it a merciless illness, or poison from her own mother-in-law, the feared bona sforza? From a widow in Lithuania to the throne of Poland, Barbara's love defied a kingdom, yet ended in suspicion, isolation, and tragic death. In the cold December of 1520, in the heart of Vilnius, a daughter was born into one of the most formidable families of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Her name was Barbara Radziwiłł. To most, she was just another child of nobility, destined to be married off in exchange for land, titles, or alliances. But to her family, the mighty Radziwiłłs, she was something more. She was another pawn in a dynasty that was steadily weaving its name into the very fabric of Eastern Europe. The Radziwiłł family was not simply rich. They were colossal. Landowners of vast estates, commanders of armies, patrons of the church and the arts. They wielded influence that rivaled even monarchs. Their very name inspired both admiration and suspicion. To ally with them meant protection and power. To oppose them was to risk isolation in the ruthless chessboard of 16th century politics. From the moment Barbara opened her eyes to the world, she was branded not as an individual, but as a symbol. Her father, Jerzy Radziwiłł, was a stern figure, powerful, calculating, with an iron will that made him respected among nobles and feared by rivals. Her mother, Barbara Kola, came from another line of prestige, ensuring that their children were born into privilege. Yet, in that privilege lay a suffocating truth. Their lives were not their own. Every meal, every lesson, every gesture was in preparation for a role that served the dynasty, not the self. For Barbara, childhood was gilded, but never free. Vilnius was no ordinary city. It was a melting pot of cultures: Polish, Lithuanian, Ruthenian, German, Jewish. Merchants filled the cobbled streets, churches echoed with hymns in different tongues, and soldiers marched in and out of its walls. It was a city alive with ambition, and within its mansions, the Radziwiłł name echoed like a thunderclap. Barbara learned early that her laughter, her beauty, her very presence would one day be currency in the marketplace of power. At banquets, she would sit silently beside her parents, absorbing the stiff rituals of aristocracy. The golden chalices, the tapestries telling tales of battles, the whispers that rose and fell like smoke. Men with jeweled belts and women with heavy gowns would glance at her, appraising her as though she were a rare horse or jewel. Too young to understand, yet old enough to feel, Barbara sensed she was both prized and trapped. The world beyond Vilnius was shifting. The Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, bound in a loose and uneasy union since 1386, were entering a period of tension. The Jagiellon dynasty ruled both lands, but its authority was not absolute. Unlike other monarchies, the Polish-Lithuanian nobility, the Szlachta, held extraordinary power. The king himself could be checked, challenged, even defied by his nobles. In this world, marriages were more than unions of affection. They were political strategies designed to balance power, cement loyalties, or secure land. Barbara, as a Radziwiłł, was destined to play her part. From girlhood, she was whispered about as a future bride who could bind families, kingdoms, or ambitions together. A smile here, an education there. Every detail of her upbringing was carefully sculpted to make her a desirable match. She learned Latin, Polish, and perhaps some Italian through the influence of foreign tutors. She was taught how to dance with grace, how to speak with just enough wit to charm but never to offend, and how to conceal her emotions behind a veil of composure. But inside she was human, restless, curious, longing. She could see the gilded cage around her, even if she did not yet know how it would close. The tapestries, the jewels, the music of the court could not silence the growing sense that her life was not hers to shape. She belonged to her family, and through them, to history. By the time she was a teenager, whispers about her beauty had spread. Chroniclers later described her as one of the most striking women of her age. Her features, delicate yet commanding, with dark eyes that seemed to hide storms, made her stand out in a court where appearances mattered as much as lineage. Men noticed, women envied, and nobles calculated. A girl like Barbara could not walk unseen, even if she wished. The Radziwiłł ambition only sharpened this gaze. Their enemies accused them of arrogance, of hungering for influence beyond what nobles should reach. Their allies praised their cunning and loyalty. Barbara was drawn into this maelstrom. Every choice she made, every friendship she formed, every whisper about her heart could ripple outward into the politics of kingdoms. And so, even in youth, her life bore the marks of tragedy to come. To the outside world, she was radiant, the daughter of one of the most powerful men in Lithuania, raised in halls of wealth and culture. But beneath the surface, Barbara was already a prisoner, not in chains of iron, but in chains of expectation. She was not free to love whom she pleased, to choose her destiny, to live an ordinary life. The men around her spoke of duty, honor, and bloodlines. But for Barbara, the words meant sacrifice, silence, and invisibility. She would soon discover just how heavy those chains could become. For when her first marriage was arranged, it was not for her heart, but for the ambitions of those who carried her name. Barbara Radziwiłł, the girl from Vilnius, had been born into brilliance. Yet even brilliance, when caged, casts long shadows. And those shadows were lengthening, preparing to follow her into every step of her short, tragic journey. In the year 1537, Barbara Radziwiłł, not yet 18, was married to Stanisław Gostowd. He was no ordinary man. Gostowd was one of the richest magnates of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, governor of Novogrodek, and a name carved into the political landscape. To her family, it was a victory. To Barbara, it was destiny fulfilling itself, another step in the long march of obligation. The wedding was splendid, filled with the rituals of nobility. Priests intoned their blessings, noble guests admired the union, and the Radziwiłłs smiled, satisfied. For the Radziwiłł clan, the marriage was more than a personal alliance. It was the weaving of another strand in their web of influence. A daughter married into power meant greater stability, greater leverage. But what did it mean for Barbara? A teenage girl with eyes full of storms, she stepped into a household ruled not by affection, but by expectation. Gostowd was older, stern, and bound more to his estates and his titles than to the fragile heart of a young bride. Their union produced no children. Their conversations, if any warmth existed, have been lost to history. Barbara learned again the silence of duty. For 5 years, she lived as his wife. She wore the jewels of his house, walked through the halls of his estates, entertained his allies, and bowed to his authority. And yet, in the midst of that gilded routine, she remained strangely invisible. No songs were sung of their union. No chronicles of tenderness survived. It was a marriage like countless others among nobles, pragmatic, necessary, and devoid of poetry. Then, in 1542, The silence was broken. Gustav died suddenly, leaving Barbara a widow at just 22. The halls of his estates grew quiet, their lords gone. The silken threads of her marriage dissolved in an instant, and Barbara was thrust into a new reality. Widowhood, for a noblewoman, was both a curse and a dangerous freedom. On one hand, she was vulnerable. A young widow, wealthy by inheritance, attractive by nature, and without children, she became a subject of scrutiny, suspicion, and intrigue. Noblemen looked at her as a potential match. Rival families whispered about her beauty and her wealth. Priests reminded her of virtue and restraint. She was suddenly a piece of property, floating in a sea of ambitions. On the other hand, she had a rare kind of freedom. No longer tethered to a husband, she had room, at least in appearance, to breathe. She controlled her dowry, her possessions, her daily life in ways few married women could. For the first time since childhood, Barbara lived under no man's authority. At least, not directly. Yet freedom for a woman like her was an illusion. The eyes of society were merciless. In the rigid morality of the 16th century, a widow of noble birth was supposed to live quietly, modestly, and obediently, awaiting either remarriage or a pious retirement. Any sign of independence, any whisper of passion, any step outside the narrow corridor of expectation could turn into scandal. And scandal was deadly. Barbara, however, carried within her a fire that would not be extinguished. The years of silent duty had not broken her spirit. She still longed, still hoped, still believed in the possibility of a life beyond transactions of power. Behind her composed face, she was alive, hungry for meaning, for connection, for something resembling love. It was in this vulnerable, perilous chapter of her life that fate prepared its most dangerous encounter. For in the corridors of Vilnius, in the courts and palaces where nobles gathered, Barbara would meet a man who was unlike any she had ever known. He was young, magnetic, and burdened with the weight of a crown he had not yet inherited in. He was Sigismund Augustus, the only son of King Sigismund Augustus and Queen Bonisforza. The world saw Barbara as a widow of opportunity. Sigismund Augustus saw her as something else entirely. But before that fateful love began, Barbara endured the long, uncertain limbo of widowhood. Days spent in silence, cloaked in black. Nights filled with the cold absence of companionship. Her beauty, once a source of admiration, now became a threat. Men desired her, women whispered against her, and enemies of her family plotted ways to use her situation to their advantage. The Radziwiłls, proud and ambitious, did not abandon her. But even they could not shield her from the relentless gaze of society. Barbara was watched, measured, judged. Every move could be twisted into rumor, every glance interpreted as sin. The chains of expectation, lighter than before, still weighed heavily. And yet, through that weight, something else stirred. Resolve. The death of her husband had stripped away illusions. Marriage had not brought her happiness, only another form of confinement. Widowhood, though perilous, offered the faintest glimpse of possibility. Barbara began to see herself not merely as a pawn, but as a woman with desires, choices, and the dangerous courage to pursue them. The chronicles do not tell us what she thought in those long, empty nights. But perhaps she whispered to herself the simplest truth. Life is short, and it must be lived, not endured. It was a thought that would guide her into a love that would shake kingdoms, a love that would defy kings, queens, and councils, a love that would bring her to the throne of Poland and to an early grave. For Barbara Radziwiłł, widowhood at 22 was not an ending. It was the beginning of a story that would turn her name into legend. It began quietly. No trumpet, no proclamation. Just a meeting of two souls in the labyrinthine corridors of Vilnius. Barbara Radziwiłł, widow at 22, was still cloaked in black. Sigismund Augustus, heir to the throne of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, was barely in his 20s. He carried the dignity of a prince, but his eyes betrayed youth, restless, searching, drawn to beauty like a moth to flame. No one knows the exact moment when their eyes first met. Perhaps it was at a banquet in the ducal palace where courtiers whispered behind gilded goblets. Perhaps it was in the shadow of Vilnius Castle, where nobles gathered for ceremonies and hunts. What is certain is that once they met, something irreversible took hold. For Augustus, Barbara was not just another noblewoman. She was luminous. Her beauty was famous even among those who never dared speak her name aloud. Dark, expressive eyes, features carved with elegance, a presence that silenced conversation. She carried herself with both fragility and fire, a contradiction that only deepened his fascination. For Barbara, Augustus was more than a prince. He was a man willing to see her not as a pawn, but as a person. He spoke to her with warmth, listened when others dismissed, and, most dangerously, saw her longing. His voice, his presence, his attention awakened something she had buried under years of duty. Desire. Their world, however, was merciless. The Jagiellon dynasty did not permit love to dictate its future. Princes married for alliances, queens were chosen for dowries, and every wedding was a treaty dressed in silk. For Augustus to look at Barbara, a widow, a Radziwiłł, a woman whose name carried both wealth and suspicion, was scandalous. To touch her would be reckless. To love her would be treasonous. And yet, they loved. Theirs was a love born in secrecy. Hidden letters passed by loyal servants, late-night conversations behind shuttered windows. Brief moments stolen between duties when the world fell silent, and they could pretend they were just a man and a woman, not pawns of kingdoms. In those moments, Barbara laughed freely. Augustus smiled without restraint. They belonged to each other, if only in shadows. But shadows cannot hold forever. By 1547, their love could no longer remain invisible. Augustus defied his father, King Sigismund I, and married Barbara in secret. The marriage was a thunderclap across Europe. A Jagiellon prince, heir to 2 crowns, had bound himself not to a foreign princess with armies at her back, but to a Lithuanian widow whose family already threatened the balance of power. The court was outraged. The nobles were scandalized. Queen Bona Sforza, his mother, was enraged. She had groomed Augustus for a dynastic union that would strengthen their house. To see him throw away that future for passion was, to her, not only foolish, but unforgivable. Whispers spread like wildfire. Barbara was called a temptress, a witch, a woman who had ensnared a prince with beauty and cunning. Some claimed she sought the throne through seduction. Others accused the Radziwiłł family of orchestrating the affair, pushing Barbara into Augustus's arms as a strategy for power. Every insult, every suspicion, every lie was hurled at her. And yet, Augustus refused to bend. He would not deny his love. In their letters, rare fragments that survive, Augustus's devotion is unmistakable. He called her his only one, his beloved beyond measure. He swore to protect her, to fight for her against nobles, against his own mother, against the kingdom itself. "Without you," he wrote, I would not want the throne at all. For Barbara, this devotion was both salvation and danger. She had never been loved like this, not in her brief, cold marriage, not in the watchful halls of her family. Augustus gave her not just affection, but recognition. He saw her as human. He saw her as worthy of love. But she also knew what it cost. Every kiss was defiance. Every embrace was treason. Every step closer to him pushed her further from safety. She was no longer simply a widow navigating suspicion. She was the wife of a prince who had turned his back on duty. And the world would not forgive her for it. The scandal of their secret marriage was only the beginning. With the death of King Sigismund Augustus in 1548, Augustus ascended the throne. In that moment, their private rebellion became a public war. Barbara was no longer just his forbidden love. She was his queen. And yet, from the very first day, her crown was poisoned. In 1548, the bells of Krakow tolled for the death of King Sigismund the Old. The great monarch of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania was gone. His son, Sigismund Augustus, was now king. But he did not step into power alone. At his side stood Barbara Radziwiłł, no longer just a widow, no longer just a secret bride, but queen. The announcement struck like lightning. In a realm where every royal marriage was calculated like a chess move, the news was unthinkable. The Jagiellon dynasty, one of Europe's most prestigious, had bound itself not to a Habsburg, nor to a Valois, nor to a powerful ally abroad. Instead, the new king had chosen Barbara, the woman who had been whispered about in scandal, despised for her family's ambition, distrusted for her influence. The coronation was lavish, but beneath its golden canopy seethed fury. Nobles muttered in the Sejm, Poland's parliament. The Szlachta, the proud gentry who guarded their privileges jealously, were outraged. To them, Barbara was not a queen, but an interloper, a living symbol of the Radziwiłł's overreach. Her crown glittered, but it burned. The fiercest opposition came from one person, Bona Sforza, Augustus's mother. She had ruled Poland alongside her husband with iron resolve, building alliances, crushing rivals, and weaving intrigue across Europe. For years, she had envisioned her son marrying a foreign princess who would bring armies, dowries, and prestige. Instead, he had bound himself to Barbara, a match she considered beneath the dignity of their dynasty. Bona's fury was volcanic. She accused Barbara of witchcraft, of luring her son with spells and seduction. At court, she spread rumors that Barbara was immoral, greedy, even diseased. Her venom dripped into every chamber of Krakow's Wawel castle. For Barbara, each corridor became a gauntlet of stares, whispers, and outright hostility. And yet, Augustus refused to yield. He stood before the Sejm, before bishops and magnates, and declared his devotion. "If Barbara is taken from me," he swore, "I will abdicate my throne." His words shocked the assembly. To the nobles, it was arrogance. To his enemies, it was weakness. But to Barbara, it was both salvation and doom. The Sejm turned into a battlefield of voices. Magnates thundered that the Radziwiłłs would soon dominate the throne. Bishops questioned the sanctity of a marriage conducted in secret. Some nobles even petitioned the king to annul it. But Augustus held firm, his crown in one hand, Barbara's fate in the other. The young queen, meanwhile, endured the storm in silence. She sat in chambers heavy with tapestries, her beauty now her weapon and her curse. Each gesture was scrutinized, each gown was judged. If she smiled, she was vain. If she wept, she was manipulative. If she remained silent, she was accused of plotting. She could not win. But she had one ally, and it was the only ally that mattered: the king himself. Augustus shielded her as best he could. He dined with her openly, paraded her at ceremonies, wrote letters filled with devotion. In private, he clung to her as a man drowning clings to a lifeline. He called her his comfort, his joy, his only peace amid the chaos. Still, even love has limits against a kingdom's fury. The more Augustus defended Barbara, the more the nobles resisted him. The more he proclaimed her innocence, the louder they accused her. The court became a furnace, its heat pressing down upon the young queen. Her crown, placed upon her head with ritual splendor, seemed less a symbol of honor than a wreath of fire. Beyond the palace walls, the people whispered too. To some, Barbara was a tragic heroine, the beautiful woman for whom a king defied the world. To others, she was a danger, a Radziwiłł puppet queen who would drain the kingdom of wealth and favor. Songs, rumors, and prayers tangled in the streets, weaving her name into every tavern and chapel. Barbara herself remained outwardly composed, but inside she must have felt the weight. She was a queen without allies, adored by one man, despised by nearly all others. She had achieved the highest station a woman of her time could reach. And yet it brought her only isolation. She had been raised to no duty. But no tutor, no parent, no mentor could have prepared her for this. The crown that burned rather than shone. In these early years of Augustus's reign, the couple lived in defiance, but also in siege. Their chambers became both sanctuary and prison. Love gave them strength, but love could not dissolve the hostility that surrounded them. The crown that Barbara wore glittered in sunlight, but in candlelight, it cast shadows long and ominous. For Barbara Radziwiłł, becoming queen was no triumph. It was the beginning of her undoing. Barbara Radziwiłł was queen in name, but in truth, she was in exile within her own palace. From the moment she set foot in Unveiled castle, she was surrounded not by courtiers eager to serve, but by enemies eager to see her fall. The hostility was suffocating. Nobles muttered openly that she was unworthy of the throne. Bishops questioned her morality. Foreign envoys sent back letters dripping with contempt. Even the tapestries of Unveiled, heavy with scenes of kings and saints, seemed to look down on her as if she were an intruder. At the heart of this campaign was Bona Sforza, her mother-in-law. Bona was no ordinary queen dowager. She was a woman born into the ruthless courts of Italy, raised in the poison-drenched politics of Milan and Bari. She had survived betrayals, assassinations, and wars. She understood power in ways that few men did, and she despised Barbara with every fiber of her being. To Bona, Barbara was not just a rival for her son's love. She was a threat to everything she had built. For years, Bona had maneuvered to keep her son tethered to her authority. Now, a young widow from Lithuania had stolen his heart and, worse, his obedience. Bona responded with the weapons she knew best: rumor, manipulation, and venom. She whispered that Barbara was licentious, that she had ensnared Augustus with witchcraft, that she cared only for wealth. In an age when accusations of sorcery could ruin a woman's life, these whispers were deadly. Soon, courtiers repeated them. Priests hinted at them in sermons. The poison spread faster than truth ever could. Barbara's childlessness made matters worse. In a court obsessed with dynasties, her failure to produce an heir was not seen as misfortune, but as proof of guilt. They called her barren, cursed, unfit for the sacred role of motherhood. Every month that passed without a pregnancy deepened her isolation. Every banquet where she sat childless made the nobles more certain that she was a disaster. Inside the castle walls, she became a ghost at her own table. Courtiers averted their eyes. Servants whispered as she passed. She could hear the scrape of silk and the hiss of voices behind doors that closed too quickly. Even music at feasts sounded hollow, as though the violins played against her. But Barbara endured. She walked the halls with dignity, her beauty untouched by the malice around her. Chroniclers say she dressed with elegance, her gowns shimmering with embroidery, her jewels glinting under candlelight. Yet every piece of finery was also a shield, armor against scorn. Behind the pearls and velvet, she carried loneliness so deep it hollowed her. Only Augustus remained her ally. The king adored her openly, defiantly. He sat by her side in court. He addressed her as his equal. He wrote to her with words drenched in love. In a Europe where kings often treated queens as mere symbols, Augustus's devotion was extraordinary. But that devotion only fanned the flames. The more he clung to Barbara, the more his nobles despised her. The same became a theater of humiliation. Nobles stood before the king and railed against his wife, calling her a disgrace to the throne. Bishops declared that God had cursed their marriage. When Augustus threatened to abdicate if Barbara was harmed, the nobles sneered. To them, he was weak, enslaved by passion for a woman unworthy of his crown. Barbara was caught in a paradox she could not escape. To be queen was to be visible, yet every gesture of visibility made her more hated. To retreat into silence would only confirm her guilt. She lived in constant tension, a queen who could neither rule nor withdraw. And still, her enemies did not relent. Bona Sforza's campaign reached even into her private chambers. Servants loyal to the dowager reported her every movement. Gifts sent to her were laced with suspicion. Even the food she ate was questioned. Barbara lived under the shadow of invisible daggers, never certain whether her downfall would come from gossip, decree, or poison. Her health began to waver, though not yet fatally. Headaches, fevers, sudden weakness, perhaps the toll of stress, perhaps something darker. Doctors prescribed tonics and prayers. None could ease the heaviness pressing on her body and her spirit. In public, she remained regal, her face serene. But behind closed doors, one imagines tears soaking her pillows. Letters clutched in trembling hands, prayers whispered in the silence of night. A woman loved fiercely by her husband, hated ferociously by his kingdom, and left with no place to belong. The crown that had once seemed like a prize was now a burden crushing her. She had dreamed, perhaps, of being cherished, of living in peace with the man who loved her. Instead, she had become the most despised woman in Poland. The fire of the crown burned hotter, and Barbara, surrounded by enemies, was already beginning to feel the first sparks of the illness, or the poison, that would soon consume her life. In the storm that raged around them, Sigismund Augustus stood alone against his own court. Where the nobles saw scandal, he saw devotion. Where bishops thundered about sin, he saw sanctity. For him, Barbara Radziwiłł was not simply a wife. She was the reason the crown held meaning at all. He made it clear in ways no one could ignore. Before the Sejm, the very stage of Polish politics, he declared with fire, "If anyone harms my Barbara, I will cast aside this crown." The words dropped like molten iron. The hall fell into stunned silence. A king had threatened abdication not for land, not for war, but for a woman. To some it was madness, to others weakness, but to Barbara it was both salvation and terror. She knew what it meant for a monarch to defy his entire court. She knew what whispers such defiance would unleash. Still, she could not deny what it stirred in her heart. For once, she was not alone in her fight. Letters between them revealed the depth of his obsession. He called her the joy of my soul, my beloved above all. He told her that without her, kingship was ash. His love was not polite or ceremonial. It was fierce, consuming, desperate. For Augustus, the crown was negotiable. Barbara was not. But love could not quiet the malice of a kingdom. The nobles did not soften. Bona Sforza did not relent. Instead, their hostility grew sharper. If Barbara had been unpopular before, Augustus's devotion made her infamous now. Every gesture of his affection, every gift, every public embrace was fuel for the fire of their hatred. The queen, radiant in jewels, lived in a palace that felt like a prison. She had no true friends among the courtiers. Ladies in waiting were chosen not for loyalty to her, but for loyalty to factions within the nobility. Conversations ended when she entered a room. Invitations excluded her name. She was watched, measured, and dissected like a specimen under glass. At banquets, when Augustus raised her cup with tenderness, eyes rolled in contempt. When he danced with her, whispers spread of sorcery. When he praised her beauty, nobles muttered about deceit. She was trapped in a cage of mirrors, every reflection distorted into accusation. And yet, behind the marble walls, there was tenderness. In the chambers where politics could not reach, they shared moments of warmth. He read poetry aloud. She teased him with wit. They sat by firelight, whispering dreams of a future where love was not rebellion. These were fleeting refuges, fragile havens against the storm. Still, isolation took its toll. Barbara was young, yet she aged quickly under the weight of scorn. Her laughter dimmed. Her letters grew heavy with melancholy. She had thought love might save her, but love had become a double-edged sword, shielding her from despair, but painting a larger target on her back. For Augustus, each insult against his wife was a wound. He argued with bishops, clashed with senators, and ignored petitions from his nobles. His reign, still young, was already marked by conflict, not with foreign enemies, but with his own court. And at the center of this battle was not policy, not land, not war, but the frail figure of a woman who had dared to be queen. Beyond Krakow, Europe watched with fascination. In the Habsburg courts, diplomats smirked at the scandal. In Rome, whispers reached the Pope himself, who questioned the legitimacy of the marriage. In Milan, Bona Sforza's kin shook their heads at her humiliation. The story of Barbara Radziwiłł was no longer confined to Poland. It had become a European spectacle, a tale of passion clashing with politics. Inside the palace, though, the spectacle was cruel. Barbara rarely left her chambers. When she did, her steps echoed in corridors lined with suspicion. She lived surrounded by gold and marble, yet she was poorer in companionship than the peasants who sang outside the castle gates. And then came the cruelest twist. Love could not change her fate. Augustus had promised the world, but he could not alter the hearts of his nobles. He could not silence his mother. He could not erase the venom whispered into every ear. Barbara had once been a pawn of her family. Now she was a pawn of passion. Both roles left her powerless. Both roles pressed her toward tragedy. In the quiet hours of night, perhaps she understood. The very man who loved her beyond reason was also the man whose crown chained her to suffering. Without Augustus, she would never have been queen. But without the crown, she might have lived. Their love burned brightly, defiantly against the world. But every fire consumes what it touches, and for Barbara Radziwiłł, that fire was already eating away at the fragile walls of her strength. The kingdom would not forgive her. The court would not relent, and soon her body itself would turn against her, whether by illness or by poison, or by the cruel will of history. It began quietly, a faint discomfort, a sharp pang in the abdomen. At first, Barbara dismissed it. Court life was heavy with stress, and she had endured whispers far harsher than pain. But as weeks turned to months, the symptoms grew impossible to ignore. By 1549, the Queen's health had become a matter of hushed rumor. She suffered fevers that drenched her in sweat. Sudden fits of pain bent her double. Her once radiant complexion paled, her strength drained. She could no longer disguise her decline behind jewels and silk. Witnesses later described the transformation with unease. Barbara, once luminous in beauty, began to wither. Her skin, they said, broke into sores. Her body weakened until even rising from her bed was an ordeal. Breath came heavy, labored, as if each inhale were dragged from her chest by force. The royal physicians were summoned, one after another. They prescribed tonics, herbal infusions, prayers, and rituals. They bled her, as was the custom of the age. They burned incense, applied poultices, invoked saints. None of it mattered. The illness deepened. The Queen's chamber filled with the scent of sickness, damp linen, bitter herbs, and the lingering fear that death was near. To her enemies, the illness was proof of God's judgment. Priests whispered that her barrenness had now been confirmed by divine punishment. Nobles muttered that a cursed woman had brought ruin to their king. For Bona Sforza, the illness was opportunity, though whether she hastened it with poison, as rumor insisted, remains one of history's unanswered questions. To her husband, the king, it was agony. Sigismund Augustus watched helplessly as the woman he loved with ferocity wasted before his eyes. He abandoned hunts, banquets, and even affairs of state to sit at her bedside. At night, courtiers found him still there, clutching her hand, whispering words of comfort to a woman slipping away. Yet even his presence could not shield her from despair. Barbara lived surrounded by wealth, but her room had become a chamber of suffering. The heavy curtains kept out the sun. The fire burned low, yet could not warm her trembling frame. Every sound, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of attendants, the shuffle of physicians, reminded her that she was watched, studied, and pitied in. Her body betrayed her dignity. Once praised for her elegance, she now struggled to maintain the simplest gestures of queenly grace. At feasts, she could no longer appear. At ceremonies, she was absent. Rumors spread faster. The queen was dying, the throne cursed, the king bewitched by a doomed woman. And still, Augustus loved her. In letters written during this period, his devotion is striking. He wrote not of policy or war, but of her health, her suffering, his prayers that she might recover. He begged her to eat, to drink, to endure. He promised her that no matter what the nobles said, he would never abandon her. His words dripped with desperation, for he knew what others dared not say. Barbara's life was slipping away, and nothing, not love, not power, not a crown, could hold it. Her illness lasted months, a slow and merciless erosion. Unlike sudden death, which strikes like lightning, Barbara's decline was a candle guttering in the wind. Each day she faded a little more. Each week brought another symptom, some days bleeding, Other days, agony that left her screaming into her pillows. Her attendants recoiled, horrified but powerless. It was in these months that suspicion hardened into legend. Was it cancer, eating her from within, as modern historians suggest? Or was it poison, slow, deliberate, administered by the Queen Mother's hand? The sores, the rapid decline, the relentless pain, all seemed to fit the whispers of poison. And yet, there was no proof. Only shadows, only doubt. For Barbara herself, the distinction hardly mattered. Whether illness or murder, the result was the same. She was trapped in her own body, condemned to suffer under the eyes of a hostile court. She, who had once been despised for her beauty, was now pitied for her decay. The same courtiers who had sneered at her gowns now shook their heads at her weakness. And yet, she endured with a strange courage. Even when pain racked her body, she tried to maintain composure in front of Augustus. She smiled faintly, whispered gratitude, asked him to care for himself. In those fleeting gestures, she showed not just the queen she had been, but the woman she still was. Resilient, dignified, even in ruin. By 1551, her decline could no longer be hidden. The court buzzed with certainty. Barbara Radziwiłł was dying. Some rejoiced quietly, believing God had rid them of an interloper. Others shuddered at the sight of a young queen consumed so cruelly. For Augustus, it was torment beyond words. He clung to her bedside like a man refusing to drown. He ordered more physicians, more prayers, more rituals. But even kings cannot bargain with death. The crown sat heavy on his head, useless against the enemy consuming his wife. In the silence of those final nights, Barbara must have known. She had fought against nobles, against a queen mother, against an entire kingdom. But now, the battle was within her flesh, and it was one she could not win. The illness, whether natural or forced, was dragging her toward the grave. And with each passing day, the tragic truth became clearer. Barbara Radziwiłł would not live to see her 31st birthday. When Barbara Radziwiłł's body began to fail, the court split into two camps: those who saw the hand of God and those who smelled poison. The symptoms were cruel and relentless. Her abdomen swelled with pain. Her skin erupted into lesions. Her breath turned shallow, her voice frail. She wasted before their eyes. To the physicians of the 16th century, these were mysteries without answers. They prescribed bleeding, potions, charms. None brought relief, and so speculation filled the void. One explanation was whispered in medical tones: disease. Some suggested cancer, perhaps of the womb, consuming her from within. Others thought of infections or of maladies peculiar to women, worsened by stress and the venom of the court. In a world without microscopes or modern science, these words carried little certainty. But to later historians, the cancer theory seemed plausible. The slow, wasting decline, the sores, the agony, the inevitability. Yet to Barbara's contemporaries, disease felt too simple, too natural. Her enemies wanted a darker story. Her mother-in-law, Bona Sforza, provided the perfect villain. Bona had the motive. She despised Barbara. She had the opportunity, access to food, to medicine, to the very chambers where the queen suffered. And she had the reputation. Born in the ruthless courts of Italy, Bona was rumored to know the arts of poison. Whispers grew louder. Bona had killed her daughter-in-law. Some said she laced Barbara's meals with arsenic. Others claimed she slipped venom into her medicines. There were even those who believed she poisoned the very air of her chambers. Each tale more elaborate, each one more certain that Barbara was not dying of fate, but of murder. The court fed on these rumors. In taverns, peasants repeated them. In churches, priests alluded to them. Across Europe, letters carried the scandal to foreign courts. The image of a young queen poisoned by her own mother-in-law was too compelling to ignore. It became legend while Barbara still breathed. And yet, the truth remained hidden. There was no confession, no proof, no witness bold enough to accuse Bona directly. The Queen Dowager herself denied the charges, furious that her name was stained. She insisted Barbara's illness was divine judgment, nothing more. But the venom of rumor, once released, could not be recalled. For Augustus, the debate was torment. He could not bear to believe his own mother had murdered the woman he loved. Yet he could not ignore the whispers that followed him through every corridor. He watched his wife deteriorate and asked himself, was this illness or betrayal? Was he helpless before nature or before conspiracy? In his heart, he did not care. Whether disease or poison, the result was the same. Barbara was dying. His devotion to her did not falter. He sat by her bed, brushed damp hair from her forehead, kissed hands that trembled with fever. He spoke to her as if words could hold her to life. He promised her she was still his queen, still his beloved, still the reason he would endure. But in the silence between his words, Barbara must have heard the truth. Her body told her, her strength told her. The shadows lengthening in her chamber told her. She was slipping beyond reach, and all the whispers of poison and disease blurred together into one reality. Her end was near. Modern historians debate with caution. Some argue for cervical cancer, its symptoms echoing those described in chronicles. Others leave open the possibility of poisoning, though the evidence is circumstantial. Forensic certainty is impossible. Barbara's body, like her reputation, was claimed by time. Yet perhaps the question itself misses the deeper tragedy. For Barbara, what mattered was not whether she was poisoned by another's hand or by her own failing flesh. What mattered was that she died in suspicion, in isolation, in pain. She was denied the peace of innocence. Even her suffering became a weapon for her enemies, another story to tarnish her name. The irony is haunting. If she was poisoned, her story became a cautionary tale of cruelty within dynasties. If she was ill, her story became a cautionary tale of how hatred invents its own explanations. Either way, Barbara was stripped of dignity. Her death was no longer her own. It belonged to rumor, to politics, to history's endless hunger for scandal. In those final months, she may have felt it, that even as her body broke, her name was being twisted, that the world outside her chamber would not remember her suffering with compassion, but with suspicion. That love had raised her to the throne, but hatred would drag her memory into shadows. She had been crowned queen. She had been adored by her husband. But now she was reduced to a riddle, poison or disease, victim or temptress, innocent or guilty. The truth was simpler and far more human. She was a young woman who wanted love, who found it, and who paid for it with her life. On May 8th, 1551, the chamber of Wawel Castle fell silent. Barbara Radziwiłł, Queen of Poland and Grand Duchess of Lithuania, breathed her last. She was only 30 years old. The crown upon her head had lasted scarcely 3 years. Her love story, which had once defied kingdoms, ended not in triumph, but in the hushed rattle of death. For the courtiers who had despised her, the moment was anticlimax. There was no great reckoning, no thunder from heaven. Only a body stilled in bed, pale and wasted, surrounded by attendants too weary to weep. Some nobles muttered prayers of thanks. Others sighed in relief. The scandal that had plagued the court was, in their eyes, finally extinguished. But for one man, the loss was unbearable. Sigismund Augustus did not accept her death as an end. He clung to her as if love itself could reverse the cruelty of fate. Chronicles tell us he spent nights beside her corpse, refusing to leave her side. He kissed her lifeless hands, whispered words as though she could still hear, and raged at the silence that gave him nothing in return. For a king raised to rule dispassionately, his grief was shocking. Kings were supposed to bury their wives and remarry, forging new alliances. Kings were supposed to stand stoic, showing loyalty to dynasty, not despair for love. But Augustus shattered expectation. He wept openly. He ignored counsel. He lingered by Barbara's coffin while the affairs of state went neglected. The court recoiled at his vulnerability. To them, it was weakness, unbecoming of a monarch. To him, it was humanity, the only response left to a heart torn apart. He had defied nobles, bishops, even his mother for Barbara. And now, stripped of her presence, he was a man broken. The crown on his head meaningless without the woman who had given it light. The rituals of mourning unfolded with cold precision. Priests intoned Latin prayers, incense filled the chapel. Nobles in black processed solemnly, their faces masks of etiquette. But the chill of politics hovered over the ceremony. Many of those who bowed before the coffin had wished for Barbara's death. Their gestures were hollow, their mourning forced. Augustus saw it. He felt it. He knew that the kingdom grieved little, if at all. The same nobles who had mocked her living now pretended reverence in death. He sat apart from them, clutching her memory, furious at the emptiness of their ritual. For him, the funeral was not politics. It was an open wound. He ordered her embalmed, her body preserved with care. Some say he demanded that her coffin remain open longer than custom allowed, so he could look upon her face, even as decay crept in. It was a macabre devotion, but devotion nonetheless. The final act of a man unwilling to surrender what little remained of his beloved. Letters from foreign envoys recorded the scandal of his grief. The king, one wrote, acts more like a widower of low birth than a monarch. He cannot part from her body as though she were still alive. Another sneered that Poland was leaderless, its ruler lost in tears. But behind their scorn was an unspoken recognition. This was not ordinary mourning. This was love, raw and unrestrained, brought low before all the world. Barbara's enemies had hoped her death would end her influence. But in a way, it did the opposite. The king's grief kept her presence alive. Every night he spent by her coffin, every tear shed before the court, was a reminder that she still haunted him. His refusal to move on bound her to the throne even more tightly than life had. And yet, grief is also a prison. Augustus, consumed by sorrow, grew increasingly detached from his duties. He signed decrees with reluctance, spoke to his ministers with little interest, and avoided public appearances. The kingdom needed a king. Instead, it had a widower kneeling before a coffin. Even in her absence, Barbara remained divisive. Some pitied the king, admiring his devotion. Others despised him further, seeing weakness that threatened the realm. Nobles urged him to remarry, to forge alliances, to produce heirs. But Augustus resisted. How could he replace the woman for whom he had risked everything? How could he marry another when Barbara's shadow still lay across his heart? In the quiet hours of the night, he wrote to her. letters unsent, prayers whispered into silence, fragments of poetry left on her tomb. He confessed his loneliness, his longing, his regret that love had not been enough to protect her. He cursed his crown, cursed his kingdom, cursed the fate that had stolen her. These words were never meant for history, but fragments remain, echoing his brokenness. Barbara's coffin was carried to Vilnius, where she was laid to rest in the cathedral. The procession was solemn, but the true weight was carried in the king's steps. He followed like a shadow, pale and unshaven, his crown gleaming, but his spirit hollow. The people who lined the streets did not cheer, did not rejoice. They watched in silence, struck by the sight of a monarch undone by grief. It was one of the most tragic scenes in Polish history, a king mourning not with dignity, but with raw despair. A queen more powerful in death than in life. A love that defied kingdoms, now defeated by mortality. For Sigismund Augustus, Barbara was not merely gone. She was everywhere, in the silence of his chamber, in the emptiness of the throne beside him. In the letters he could not send, her absence became presence, her death became his torment. And though the court moved on, and though history would march forward, the king never truly did. Barbara Radziwiłł's death did not silence her story. If anything, it magnified it. Across Poland and Lithuania, she became legend. The queen who reigned briefly, loved fiercely, and died tragically. Chroniclers painted her as both sinner and saint. Poets cast her as the heroine of doomed love. For centuries, her ghost was said to wander Wawel Castle, a restless spirit draped in white, forever searching for her king. Her enemies sought to erase her, but memory refused. Barbara endured in whispers, in songs, in the hearts of those who saw her not as a schemer, but as a woman broken by power. Her story became more than history. It became symbol, and in that symbol lay her truest victory. She was remembered not as a queen who ruled, but as a queen who loved.